guys, what's up? Serena here from thriftdiving.com, and in today's video, I'm so excited because I built a deck. I am like over the moon excited about this. This is a project I've been wanting to do for a long time, and I'll admit I was afraid to tackle this myself, but it looks amazing. It looks amazing. We're gonna jump into that in just a moment, but before we do that, I wanna tell you about today's sponsor, FilterBuy.com. Now, you had seen when I did my utility room makeover how amazing it looked, and FilterBuy was along for that journey as well. And here's the thing, when you are ordering filters for your home, you want to make sure that you're getting the right size. You want to make sure that you're changing it every 3 months. If you're like me, you kind of forget, right? And it turns into 6 months and then 8 months and then maybe a year, and you forget when you change them. Well, that's not good air quality for your home. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to filterbuy.com. I want you to find one of the 600 sizes. Yes, there's 600. And then I want you to order 4 of them. That's right. I want you to order in bulk. You get free shipping, so you get them all at one time. Set a reminder on your phone. Every 3 months, remind yourself to change your air filter. And you go down into wherever mine's in the basement, go to your air filter, take one of your new air filters and you pop it in, not even 5 minutes, just a few minutes. And that way you guarantee that the air quality in your home is good, right? You don't want to keep breathing in all that dust and debris. If you want them sent every 3 months by FilterBuy, you can do that. You decide how often you want them delivered, and it's free shipping and it comes really fast. Over the 600 sizes, they've got 3 different MERV ratings plus odor control, odor eliminators. So all you need to know is what size do you need? What MERV rating do you want? You know what to buy. It's all there at filterbuy.com, and that's where you should order your filters because that's where I get mine. Even before they became a sponsor, that's where I was getting my filters. Mine are like these big boxy weird sizes and you can't go to like a regular store locally to get them. You got to order them from filterbuy.com. So go there, get your filters, and tell them Thrift Diving sent you. Okay, are we ready to jump into this project? I am so excited about this, and I just can't wait for you to see everything that I did. What I did well, what I messed up on. That's how you learn, right? The mistakes that you make. All right, let's jump into this project right now. In my last video, this is what I was showing you that my shed looked like coming out of winter into spring. I knew that I needed to tackle this project. I had been using a pallet for, gosh, it's been almost 2 years since I've had my shed. And each time I step out, I would nearly break an ankle. So it had to get done. I had previously removed this 4x8 section of grass, again, to get rid of the insects that were getting into my shed, but I also needed to spray for the weeds. And then later you'll see that I'm putting weed block down. But the first thing I did was try to get a really good 4x8 section here marked off with some spray paint. I was very nervous to do this project because I did not want to dig down 30 inches below the frost line. I didn't want to fill it with concrete. I just didn't want to do that. I didn't think I would get it right. So anyway, one day I was actually scrolling through Facebook and saw an advertisement for Tough Blocks, and you'll see those in a moment, but that's the system that I'm using to create this deck, and it was literally the easiest way for me to do this. Now you see that I'm marking off here with spray paint. This is where I'm going to be digging the trenches. I was following a Tough Blocks tutorial from their YouTube channel, and it was telling me, okay, you want these Tough Blocks to be in about 12 inches from the edge of the deck, and this will help hide them so that they're not sticking out from the edge of the deck. So I placed them where I approximately thought that they would be located and used those as a guide to figure out how wide my trench needed to be, which was about 1 foot wide. This was a part that was very labor intensive because we have clay soil here in Maryland. So digging this stuff out, it was a lot of work. The main thing here when you're using the Tough Blocks and you're digging your trenches is that you want them to be level, and then you can make adjustments as needed. But you see that I've got a slope here from the door leading out. And so I needed to make sure that each of those trenches were level. And then you'll see that the supports will be a little shorter in the back and higher in the front in order to get this deck level. Now, I don't want any weeds coming up through this deck, so I put some weed block fabric there, pinned it down, and then we're going to do some paver base. Now, paver base is pretty important because that's going to allow your deck blocks your Tough Blocks to sit nice and level. And we also want to make sure that we have some drainage in there. So you're going to get a lot of paver base. I initially bought like 6 bags thinking, oh, that'll be plenty. No, I ended up with probably 19 bags by the time this was all said and done. So I kept having to go back to the store to get more paver base. So what I would recommend is buy more bags than you think you'll need, or go to a nursery and actually have them to deliver a truckload, because you probably are going to use a lot of paver base. You're going to compact it with a tamper, and again, check for level as you're doing this. The next step is to use some all-purpose gravel. You can use road-based gravel. That's what they recommend in their video. Home Depot and Lowe's, they don't sell road-based gravel, and I was really worried that all-purpose gravel wouldn't work, but it will. The main thing is you just want to make sure that you've got some drainage underneath of these tough blocks, and so that's where the stones, the gravel comes into play. And I tamped this down. I did check to make sure that I was in about 12 inches, and also I did check for level. So you want to make sure that you just have them approximately where you think you're going to place them in relation to where the joists will be. And once they're level, then you can get started on cutting your joists. But I will say you have to do some planning before you jump into this, before you start cutting, so that you're not wasting wood. This wood is not cheap. And so I had taught myself several years ago how to use SketchUp, and I've used it for some of the larger projects that I've done, and it's so helpful. But if you don't know how to use SketchUp, don't worry. Draft it out on paper. Put down some numbers, some measurements, so you know exactly what you're working from before you get started cutting the wood. And I knew I wanted my deck to be 4 feet coming from the shed. So that means with the back and the front of the deck being 1.5 inches thick, right? I'm using 2x6s. Then that means these joists need to be 45 inches. And can I tell you that I actually cut them to exactly 4 feet? So we make mistakes, right? We make mistakes. And so I ended up later going back and just trimming them down just a little bit to 45 inches so that the deck was 4 feet. Now keep in mind I'm using pressure treated wood here. So for any part that's cut, I need to apply a wood preservative, and I did that for all the cut parts. Now the 4x4 posts, these are going to sit inside of the tough block. You see this distance here? This is how tall the piece has to be, but this distance is what has to be notched out, because that's where the joist is going to be sitting. Now, in order to do that, I am going to be using a circular saw. If you don't know how to use a circular saw, check my tutorial on how to use a circular saw. It's really easy, but to do a post like this, you want to make a series of notches. But before you do that, you want your blade to be adjusted so that it's about halfway through the 4x4. You don't want it to go all the way through. Of course, it won't really go all the way through, but you'll want to set it so that that blade is about halfway through the 4x4 post. And I've seen some deck building videos where someone will take a 2x6, they'll just screw it directly to a 4x4 and call it a day. That's not how you should do it. You should use a circular saw or a table saw and notch it out, notch your post out like this, take a hammer, knock those pieces out, and then you'll want to take a chisel and just smooth it out, right? You're going to have a lot of pieces left over. Smooth it out, because this is where your 2x6 is going to sit. And this is going to be a much more solidly built deck because it's properly supported. So you see that 2x6 sits nicely in that notched area. I did sand out that area just a little bit, just so it's a little bit more smooth. And remember, because we cut that wood, you want to make sure that after you sanded it, if you do sand it, you want to put a coat of the wood preserver there as well. And also on the top and the bottom of wherever you're cutting that 4x4 post. And you'll notice that I actually had notched the 4x4 post first, and then I'm cutting it to size because it wasn't a long piece. It was only maybe 10.5 inches, or was it 11? It was somewhere around there. And that's how I was able to cut those. Now, keep in mind that the length of this post is from the tough block to the threshold of my door. This is the back row that I was cutting first. And once I figured out that it was about 10.5 inches, I actually don't remember, then I went ahead and completed all of the posts at one time and did the same exact thing for each of them. You'll see that I've taken that 4x4 notch post, I've put it in the tough block, I put the joist on top of it, and then I'm measuring it out to see, once it's level, what is the size of the next joist that I have to cut for that front part. And this one was a little taller, and so I cut that the exact same way. Remember, I did the wood preserver, and then I had my first piece on the left-hand side. And then I was checking for level, and you'll see that I actually didn't want it to be completely level. I wanted it to be a little sloped, and that's how I wanted it to be so water could run off. For each of the individual blocks, I did check to make sure that they were level, but also had a little bit of a slope to them as well. And remember, if you are not completely level, you can adjust these stones a little bit to make sure that you get it to be exactly where you want it to be. All right, so I went ahead and continued cutting the notches of the posts, and I was following the Tough Block YouTube video as best as I could by starting with the two sides, and then I started marking where I was going to put the joist hangers. This is where I started to get messed up. Typically, when you're framing something for the ledger board and the rim joist, those in yellow, those should be laid out together, and you should mark where your joists are going to be attached at the same time so that they match up on both boards. Well, I didn't do that. Somehow I forgot everything that I learned in carpentry school. And when I realized later, wait, this is not working out very well, then I had to go back and watch some YouTube videos on how to attach joist hangers. And you should actually squeeze them together. They do have a little bit of a gap, and so when you squeeze them together, that will actually fit around the board much better. Well, once I figured that out, then I thought, okay, I can attach these very simply. They have little prongs. You just nail those in place and then use your screws, the appropriate screws, which you can find down below in the blog post, to attach it. Well, I probably shouldn't have done that because remember, my measurements were a little off, and that got me into a little trouble. I ended up having to rip everything apart. I lost maybe like a couple days of work because of this. Anyway, you see that this first joist is going to be about 12 inches from the edge of the board. And on this side, the very end of the board, we're going to be using these brackets, these joist hangers, because this one isn't going to work, right? We need something that's going to be slim. And so these brackets will allow you to connect the outer joists to the deck. And it fits pretty well. Now, yes, those end pieces had fit pretty well, but the rest of it didn't fit very well because I didn't measure properly. Remember, that rim joist and the ledger board, those really should be marked and laid out together. And I did it separately. And then I started putting everything together thinking, this looks great. Let me work on the other board. And then when I went to try to put it together, nothing really matched up. I don't know what I did wrong, but I thought I was on the right track and then realized, yep, this is not going to work. And I was so disappointed. I thought that I was on the right track, and I ended up having to take out all the joist hangers. And I said, you know what? I have taken a framing class. I know how to frame. I don't know why I'm acting as if I don't know how to. So what I did was I removed all the joist hangers. I did have to trim down the joists a little bit because I had actually cut them at exactly 4 feet. And remember, I want them to be at 45 inches because the rim joists and the ledger board adds an additional 3 inches. So from one end to the other end, I need that to be 4 inches. So I trimmed this board down. You see it's a little too long. I trimmed that down, put a little bit of the wood preserver on it. And you see that that 45-inch joist fits nicely in the space there, and it's 4 feet across. Next, I used some 3-inch deck screws, and I did 2 on each side to connect it. And in terms of the spacing, I tried to do 16 inches on center, but the 2 on the sides, those are only 12 inches because of the deck blocks we're using. And I'm trying to check for square here. It should be equal. I think I was off about 1/4 of an inch, and I thought, you know what? I am just going to get this thing in place. I've had enough of this. We can try to square it up later. I never did end up getting it squared. But if you're off by, I would say any more than 1/4 inch, you really want to make sure that you're squaring this up by pushing and pulling until you can get those 2 corners to be exactly equal or close to it. Next up, it was time to figure out what were the sizes of the next post that I needed for this deck. You can see that it's already pretty strong in this corner, but I needed to put the other blocks in place, the deck blocks, and then take a measurement up so I can make sure that all of those were cut properly as well. Now let's talk about the placement of these deck blocks. It was my understanding that they would set in about 12 inches from all sides. And that's actually true if you have a larger deck. But because this one is so slim, these supports actually need to be closer to the edge. Now the one in the back could have gone a little closer to the shed, but actually they're fine. Where I needed to make some adjustments are the ones in the front. Initially, I put them back about 12 inches. And when I stood on top of the deck and started to make sure that this was sound and secure, you can actually see that it started rocking back and forth. And I thought, oh no, What happened here? This is not supposed to rock. Well, I reached out to Tough Block on Instagram and they were awesome. They were like, you just have to move that front row up closer to the edge and then you're going to get the structure and the rigidity and the solid base that you're looking for. And sure enough, it worked. But I did that later. At this point, I was just trying to make sure that it was square, which it wasn't. Remember, it was off a 1/4 inch. I tried to square it up. It was pretty heavy and I couldn't get it to square up and I just left it. So at this point, I was more concerned about getting the Tough Blocks into position and making sure that things were level and even. And when I say level, remember, I wanted it to slope a little bit away from the building so that rainwater could easily run off. And so to get it level, I did add a little bit more of the gravel underneath some of the blocks in order to get them to be level. I also used the 3-inch deck screws and screwed through the support, that 4x4 support, into the 2x6. And I did that for the back row. I did end up doing that for the front row until I realized that I had to remove all of them because I needed to move them closer to the front. So I wanted to add more paver base and more stones, more gravel, so that those front blocks could be moved closer to the front but still have that solid foundation, that solid base. So I tamped that down, added some stones, and then moved those forward and secured them as well. And remember those joist hangers that I had so much difficulty installing? Well, I just waited until I had the top part of the deck in place and then I installed them. Hello, Serena. I mean, come on, this was like the easiest thing ever. Sometimes you don't realize when you're doing something that there's an easier way to do it until you do it. And then you're like, oh. Also, make sure that you're using the right screws for this. You are going to have to use Simpson Strong Tie screws, and they are with the joist hangers in that section of the home improvement store. So make sure that you're using the right ones. I used the number 9, 1.5 inch for part of the joist hangers, and then the 3-inch for the other part. And then I continued to move up those deck blocks into position, and guess what? It worked, because when I stepped on this thing, it was not moving. It was solid. It was as level as I wanted it to be. And I felt really proud of myself at that moment. So the next part of this deck was to add the bracing across the 8-foot span of the deck. Now, I don't know if I actually needed to do this. Someone had said on Instagram, well, Serena, your deck is kind of small. I don't think you needed to do that. And if I didn't, I didn't. It can't hurt. If anything, it just reinforces the deck and makes it even stronger. So you see that I'm staggering the boards. And the reason why you stagger them is so that you can actually get access to screw it in with the 3-inch deck screws. And so I did that all along the 8-foot. And then I needed to add some smaller bracing on the outer sides on both ends, on the left and the right side. And the way Tough Block explains this is that because those posts with the supports are 12 inches in, you really want to make sure that you've got enough support on those corners, those edges of the deck. And so that's why additional bracing is necessary. So I used the same 3-inch deck screws, screwed those 2x6 pieces in there, and that's it. So now that the top part of the deck was done, I needed to figure out how am I going to build a step, number 1, and how am I going to attach it to this deck. So I decided to use these 9-inch pieces of 2x6s that I had cut, and I attached it to the back of the front part of the deck. And you'll see that there's some wood hanging down below. The reason why I left that wood hanging down below is because underneath of this part of the deck, I'm going to add another piece of 2x6, and I'm going to have a place to actually connect the steps. You'll see in just a moment. So I cut the 8-piece foot of board that I needed, put a little bit of wood preserver there, and I also laid out the 2x8 that I'm going to be using for the step. Now I'm using the 2x8 because it's actually 7.5 inches wide, which I thought, okay, this is going to be perfect for a step. That's a great rise for a step, right? Well, you'll see in a moment that I kind of got myself into a little trouble with that. But I'm cutting the bracing here that I'll need for the step, and of course adding the wood preserver. And I'm setting this up on the deck, and I'm using 3-inch deck screws to connect it all together. And then I had to get a little helper. I need you to hold it from underneath. Watch your fingers. Meaning, okay, move it down just a little. Okay, right there. Just hold it in place. So remember those pieces of wood, those 9-inch pieces of brackets that I applied to the back of the deck? Well, now this is what I'm attaching to it, a 2x6, and I'm attaching it with 4 screws that are 3 inches in length, and this is going to allow me to attach the steps to this front part. But here's what I realized. I need to actually add more paver base and more gravel because the steps also have to have their own tough block, and that has to be leveled. So back to the home improvement store, more weed block, more paver base, more stones. If I had planned for this properly, and I did try to plan for it, I would have realized I needed a lot more paver base, a lot more stones, and I probably could have done all of my digging at once. But, sometimes you just don't know what you don't know until you get started on that part of the project. Now, this part was actually kind of challenging because you have to consider what size step you need and how far your foot actually has to travel to get up that step. They call it rise and run in carpentry. So when you're stepping up, you have a certain minimum that you want, right? You want to make sure it's let's say 7 1/4 is pretty standard. But when you're stepping onto that step, it's got to be at least 10 inches. If you've got a 7 1/4 inch step up, you want to make sure that your tread is at least 10 inches. For me, I wanted mine to be 6 inches. So for that 6 inches, I then have to make my step a little deeper. So I made my step at 12 inches deep and then stepping up 6 inches. But here's where I ran into the problem. After I leveled and took measurements for each of the tough blocks, I was ready, or thought I was ready, to put my step in place. The problem is that I had a 6-inch step up, a 6-inch rise, which is fine because I have a 12-inch step. The problem is that I didn't account for the step up from where I was stepping up from the ground. You see where my foot is to the top of that step was actually 9 1/2 inches. So you can't have a huge 9 1/2 inch step up and then go from 9 1/2 inches to 6 inches. And I completely forgot that. So we'll figure that out in just a moment, but here's a look at what the back of those steps look like. You see the bracket that I had put in place. You see the extra 2x6 on the bracket down below, and then that's what's attaching the steps to the deck. Now, I did toenail these in with 3-inch screws. I probably should have used 3 1/2 inch, but I didn't have any 3 1/2 inch, and I just used 3-inch. And the reason why I'm toenailing them in at an angle is because I couldn't actually reach them from the back. And this is actually a stronger way to connect wood. And it was pretty solid. I did go to the hardware store and I got some angle brackets to add there for extra reassurance that these steps were not coming off. Again, I'm using Simpson strong tie screws, connectors. These are 1 1/2 inch. And I did some of these connectors at each of the junctions of where the steps are connecting to the deck. And when I was done, this baby wasn't moving. It was solid. Next, I just had to figure out how I was going to remove some of that step up going from the ground to the step. Before I could focus on that though, I had to take care of this problem because I was ready to do the decking, and if one of your joists is up a little higher than the other, then you're going to get into some problems with your decking. So I just used a hand planer, just a rigid hand planer with a battery, and removed some of that problem. And surprisingly, it worked really, really well. I did kind of gouge the wood a little bit here and there, but when I was done, it was pretty even. And you see I've got some bubbles there where I put some of the wood preserver. Make sure you're doing that. All right, now you want to make sure that you're using a joist tape. This is to protect the joist from the moisture that can get trapped underneath of the decking. And at first I thought that this was only something that was necessary if you're using composite decking, which I'm not. I'm using wood decking. But apparently this is something that you want to use even if you're doing wood decking. So make sure you pick up a couple rolls of this. This stuff goes really, really quickly. So buy more than you think you'll need. And once you've installed all of that, then it's time to cut the decking and install it. You want to make sure that your boards, from what I've researched, are smiling up at you. So look at that end grain, and that end grain should be smiling up towards the sky. And the reason why, from what I can tell, is that when it dries in this direction, it's less likely to cup. If anything, it will do the opposite so that the water will run off of the boards and not just sit in the center. Now the tool that I'm using here is called a camo. I had never used one of these before, but it was pretty simple. The idea is that it goes right on your decking, and these screws, which are 2 3/8 inch, are hidden screws. So when you're doing your deck, you don't see a bunch of screw holes. And that screw will go right into the edge and bury into the framing of your deck. And so you eliminate those screw holes where dirt and debris can get trapped. Now, here's the thing. You want to have the proper spacing, and the camo actually has, I think it's got several different sizes, but for me, I'm actually doing 1/16 spacing. And I'm hoping that once the pressure treated wood dries, it'll actually dry to about a 1/8. I do like the decking to be a little bit more tight, and so this camo will allow you to do the proper spacing. If you just move it on down the board, put it into the next one, it'll give you the proper spacing, and you don't have to think about it. You just screw it. You don't have to worry so much about trying to line your boards up on the side. You'll see in a moment that once the boards are in place, then you will cut them all at one time to get a nice clean line on the left side and the right side with the overhang. And I will tell you, there was a couple spots in the beginning of the decking, the very first piece and the last piece, where I had to use some of the screws and just go straight down into the decking to hold it in place, number one, but also two, at this point I couldn't get the camo at an angle because the shed was in the way. Now, I was really worried about the last board of the deck, the one that's closest to the shed, because number one, I was afraid that it would be too skinny. And number two, I was afraid that having my deck be out of square by 1/4 inch, I thought that it would make a huge difference. It actually didn't. I could tell that when putting this last board in, there was a little bit more tightness to the right than to the left, and that's where it was out of square, but it actually wasn't that noticeable. So I put it into place, making sure that I had the overhang about 1 3/4, and then I just used my screws and screwed it to the framing, and it was totally fine. Now, there was one board that I noticed was cracked, and also it was not positioned in the correct direction. You want the smiley face end of the board, the green, pointing up, and this one was pointing down, plus it had the crack. So I did pull out one of the decking and replaced it, and then used my track saw to trim off the side. Now, I wanted to do a 1 3/4 inch overhang, but I ended up with a little bit less. You know, sometimes things don't go as planned, but it totally looks fine. It still has an overhang, and it, of course, needed some of the wood preserver. Don't forget that. And now that the top decking was done, it was time to do the decking for the step. I did make this little jig. I cut it to be 1 3/4 inch so that when I'm checking the overhang on the steps, I could easily place it under there and then keep moving along. Now, the one board is going to be pushed up against this part of the step, and then the other decking was also put in place so that I could get the 1 3/4 overhang. Now, I did take a measurement of that centerpiece. That's the part that has to be ripped, and I used my track saw for this. This is perfect for a track saw, and I also kept in mind that I needed that spacing. I'm doing 1/16 spacing, which is kind of slim, but I'm hoping that once the board's dry, it will actually shrink a little bit. And so that's why it's a little tighter. So, of course, wood preserver on that piece, and then I screwed it into position, and it was a perfect fit. Now, one of the almost last things that I had to do was build up this area in front of the step. Remember, this was a 9.5 inch step up, which is not acceptable. That's way too high, and it needs to match the other rise, the other step up of 6 inches. So I needed to remove 3.5 inches. I added some paver base. I added some stones. These actually help, but I still needed to build it up. And I just got a little frustrated, and I said, let me just work on the fascia board. So I did rip a fascia board to put here to kind of cover up some of the brackets that you see there on the side. Of course, wood preserver. And then I screwed that in place. I did make sure that it overhang about 1 inch, because you'll see in a moment that I'm going to add a fascia board to the side. I had a little bit of the fill dirt left from when I was digging out those trenches. I used that, tamped it down, put a little bit of topsoil, and then put the stones in place, and that actually did the trick. So the last part, the very last part, was to just add a fascia board here on the side to cover up those side brackets. And at that point, I was like, dude, I am done with this deck. I just need a couple of pretty planters for those flowers, and that's it. Let's call it a day. Oh my God. Look at this deck that I built. Guys, this is the project that I've been wanting to complete for the last 2 years, and I finally did it. It's freaking amazing. It's sturdy. It's not going anywhere. I feel comfortable. I feel confident that this thing is going to last. But believe me, it was a lot of work, and it took a lot to even get to this point, but I'm glad that I did. And if you've got a project that you want to do, I know how scary it is, but you have to tackle it. Do the research, figure out all the steps, and then just give it a try. And I guarantee that you'll make mistakes along the way like I did, but I can guarantee by the time you get done, you are going to be so proud of yourself because you did it. And when I look at this, I'm like, wow, I created this. Like, I created most of this. Anyway, if you want to see the entire shed series, go down below, click the link. You can see everything that I've been doing here on the interior, the electrical that I did, all the gardening things that I did. Man, it's a lot. When you sit back and take a look at all of this, it's a lot. Anyway, we got to go inside. It's much cooler inside. A big thanks to filterby.com for sponsoring this video. Be sure to check them out. Tell them Thrift Diving sent you, and come back again, because we're always doing amazing, cool things here at Thrift Diving, pushing ourselves to the next level of DIY. All right, I'll see you next video.